Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. I'm very excited about this particular speaker. So your speaker tonight is Javier Garza, and he and I have known each other for, I think, 18 years, which is kind of unbelievable. But we went to graduate school together at the University of Texas at Austin and both got our master's degrees there. And since then, Javier has gone on to have a really remarkable career. Currently, he is a journalist based in northern Mexico, and he has a public affairs program on the radio and also does some writing. His work has appeared in American newspapers. He's written about things like El Chapo, and he's written a lot about violence in Mexico. And earlier he was an editor for a paper in northern Mexico where there was a lot of drug violence. And so he was in charge of coordinating his staff of reporters and their safety. And then after that, he went on to do a lot of talks across the world, actually, about journalist safety, focusing particularly on Latin America, but he spoke on this many places. So it's really a pleasure to have him here. And also somewhat ironic that we've brought in a journalist from Mexico to come talk to us in the United States about violence facing journalists. So I'm just delighted to have him here, and I'm glad that you're here to listen to him. So thank you.
Thanks, Andrea. Sorry I'm late. Everybody have some connectivity issues here, but all set to go. So yeah, Andrea shouldn't say how long ago we've known each other because it really just reveals our true age. But yeah, I really appreciate the invitation, and I follow how she has been able to mix the academic with the practical, and I think in this case, it came to be a very good fit. It is ironic that a country that a lot of us in other parts of the world used to look up to in terms of press freedom is now turning somewhat dangerous, somewhat risky for the exercise of journalism. So I think that the thing to keep in mind is not just the present moment, but I think also, and most importantly, how did we come to this? Because this is something that we have thought of in Mexico for years. What path did we follow? What path did we walk as journalists with our authorities and civil society to find ourselves in this moment? What I'm seeing right now in the United States, and this is where I will ask, and the reason also why I had asked Michelle and Andrea and Carolyn to ask you to compile some examples of recent incidents, is that the current climate doesn't seem to be a climate that is affecting journalists directly. There is a lot of hostility towards the press right now in the United States, as it is in a lot of places around the world. But it is usually a verbal hostility expressed in the discourse, online or in person. Journalists have not yet been targeted with a degree of wrath, I would say is the word, of fury, as journalists in other parts of the country for physical attacks. However, when you cover protests, when you cover social unrest, when you cover political events, where the situation turns violent, people used to be able to distinguish the press from the other participants and used to sort of not mess around with the press. That boundary has now been blurred. The boundary has disappeared completely. The press is now fair game for any protester, for any security force, for any politician to be a victim of their hostility. So I think that is also something very, very important to keep in mind, because that means that we're not safe in any type of coverage. And whenever things go south and whenever things turn violent, we are not going to be, there is a decreasing chance that we will be spared because we are press, because we're members of the press. So I see the group is pretty big. So we're going to try to be very methodical or very structured about how we go into the topic of journalist safety. It's not just, throw around, a bunch of safety measures and put them on a checklist, and that's it. We know that we have to be prepared when we go out the street and cover something. And in this case, we're going to focus more on social unrest, protests, riots, and political events, and also a little bit on election day. It's not just making a list of what we need. It's actually thinking through the risks that we might be facing. Michelle, can we put up the presentation, because I have no idea how to upload a presentation on Zoom.
Sure, I can do that for you.
Thanks. So the first thing that we need to do is we have to evaluate our risk and think basically in 4 different categories, which are really the broad categories of journalist safety, which is physical safety, digital security, psychological safety, and legal safety. Okay, so how do I? Okay, can I control the presentation from here?
Only if we have you display it. So it's fine. You can let me know, and I'll go ahead and yeah.
All right. Okay. So then the next one. Okay. So this is the 4 dimensions: the physical. The next one, please. Digital, legal, and psychological. And the next one, please. Okay. But the first thing that we need to do is try to first evaluate or assess our own risk. So there is always 2 actors in a confrontation. It's us as journalists, and it's our attacker. We need to identify who the attacker is, and that's also why I asked that you compile the list of recent incidents. Is that those are good to identify who is doing the aggression. Is it a protester? Is it a police officer? Is it a mob that comes from candidate supporters, or is it a counter protester? Because once we do that, then we get to break down into 4 different categories. One is regarding our attacker, his or her their capabilities. What are they capable of doing to harm us? What are their tools? What's their strength in doing us harm? And what's their will? Do they really want to harm us? Sometimes an attacker might have a lot of capabilities, but they don't care about us. So there is not that much of a risk. Sometimes it's the opposite. An attacker really wants to hurt us, but he or she doesn't have a lot of capabilities. We always have to keep in mind that an attacker with a capability and no will can eventually obtain that will, and the opposite, an attacker with a will but no capabilities will eventually obtain the capability. So we need to understand what those are. And talking about capabilities, for example, what are they armed with? Security forces, they're armed with batons, firearms, tear gas. Protesters are armed with clubs, wood rods, Molotov cocktails, whatever. And so we have to keep that in mind. We also have to assess what are our strengths, which is our physical condition is one, especially when we're out of the street covering stuff. Our training is another one. The tools that we have also from our newsroom, from our news organization. And what are our weaknesses, which is the absence of those strengths. We don't have any training. We are not in good physical shape. For example, I went, exercising yesterday and I hurt my ankle and I'm limping. Is it really a good idea that I go cover a protest where I might have to do a quick run, for example? That's to put it in a very concrete term, but that's the idea. We have to think about our weaknesses and our strengths. A weakness is, do I have health insurance? So if something happens to me, will I be taken care of? Do I have a communication device? Do I have a communication network with my colleagues? All that stuff has to factor in our risk evaluation. Next, please.
You want to go to the next slide?
Yeah. Okay. The next one. Okay. This is, from the stuff that you compiled, this is some of the questions that we need to answer. What's the general background? in the city, for example? You know, have there been any instances of violence lately? What kind of violence? Who has done the violence? Who are the attackers? What are their capabilities? What's their disposition to engage in violence? You might have, for example, that protesters have a certain disposition, but counter-protesters are probably more enraged, and so they could be more dangerous. What types of attacks? Do they beat people up with clubs? Do they gas them? Do they throw Molotov cocktails? Do they break windows? Do they attack you with a broken window, with a shard of glass or something like that? All that has to be factored in. What's the kind of coverage that triggers the attack? Especially if you belong to a certain news organization that has a negative perception in one group, say one group of protesters or one group of counter-protesters. You know how they always have their opinions about the media, and they will say, your coverage is not fair, you're manipulating, you're not reporting the truth, and they might turn violent because of that perceived grievance that they have. We also have to be very aware of that. If you published a story recently that raised a lot of hackles in a certain group of people, that's also part of the picture. If you go on television, if you, for example, on televisions, and so people know your face, it's different as if you're anonymous because you're a print journalist, for example, or a web journalist. You might be more exposed, you might be more dangerous, you might also feel more protected because you would say, well, I'm a well-known person, and so nothing's going to happen to me. That's not the case. Never feel tricked into thinking that's the case. Sometimes it's the opposite. The more known a journalist is, the more danger he or she is in. So in general, you have to identify the context of violence. The next, please, Michelle. We can just go through all of them. I'll just mention them. Okay. Okay, so physical safety. I'm going to run through these and then we can go back and share some of the stuff that you compile and see what can fit into some of these categories. So physical safety is about not only avoiding harm, but also avoid getting in a situation that can result in harm. So it's also more preventive than that. First rule, especially if you're covering a protest, social unrest, something that can turn violent, you have to move in groups or at least in pairs. Never move alone, because if you get in some sort of physical situation, if you get hurt or something, it always helps to have someone there that can help you out or take you to safety. Despite the fact that if people identify you as press, they might turn more violent, it's always good to have your ID visible. Don't take a chance, especially with the police. Police sometimes, it really depends on the mood, I think, of the people at the time, but sometimes we'll be more circumspect about hitting a journalist if they see that they're carrying a badge or they're carrying photo equipment. It's something that can be documented. There is a discussion about how convenient or not this is. Some people will argue that it's better to go incognito, but I recommend that you always have your ID visible. When you're moving in a protest or a riot or a march, especially one that's moving, you always have to identify escape routes or places to shelter. Escape routes, I mean, for example, side streets where you can just run away from a confrontation. Avoiding, of course, alleys, cul-de-sacs, or something with no way out. Narrow streets or narrow passageways, you have to avoid those. Try to identify escape routes that are fairly broad, or also places to shelter. That would be either a place where you can just write out, whatever is going on in a protest, but also you have to identify places where you can stick to in case, especially when things start flying around, projectiles, rubber bullets, things like that. Walls are usually the best place. Walls that are parallel to where the action is, so that if you see projectiles flying in one direction, it's hard to, that they're going to hit you sideways when you're up against the wall. So always identify, you know, which way the things are flying, and try to position yourself, you know, kind of like perpendicular to that, so that you can avoid them. You have to practice situational awareness. Always be aware of your surroundings, and this is important because sometimes we get too wrapped up in a story. You know, say for example, somebody gets hurt or somebody's getting beaten, and you're very wrapped up in documenting that, in taking notes, in taking pictures or video, that you forget where you are, and then something hits you. You know, something strikes you. So you have to practice situational awareness. Even if you're preparing, even if you're reporting the story, you have to still report the details of the story, but you have to be aware of your surroundings. Or you know, you can go down, you can get knocked down along with the people that you're reporting on. The next one, please. Dress is very important. You know, it really can be understated enough, and especially in places, if there is the probability that there is going to be fire, dress in cotton clothes, or with the least amount of synthetic fibers that you can find. So jeans, cotton shirts, especially long sleeved ones, that's preferred. Shoes, try not to, you know, if you, for example, running shoes, they have a lot of synthetic fibers and they can melt. They stick to your feet and burn your feet. So leather is a better option. This might seem trivial, but you know, if you get in a situation where you know, fire bombs, Molotov cocktails start flying around, you know, you need to be clothed in something that is not going to catch fire. Wear shoes that cover your whole feet. Again, avoid the synthetic. Leather is most safe. Cover your head with a baseball cap with a plastic cover. I think they're called bump caps or something like that, or a bike helmet. I mean, you know, we're not talking about CNN that, you know, you get fit with a bulletproof vest and a professional helmet. You know, this is more amateur than that, but you know, these things can help. If you wear a baseball cap, but you fit it on the inside without some sort of plastic cover, and if you wear your bike helmet, something that you can also carry in your backpack for the time when you don't need it, but it helps also to keep you more safe. Even if police is using rubber bullets, beware of rubber bullets. They can be fatal at certain close distances. So don't, you know, don't trick yourself into thinking that, well, you know, it's not live ammo, so that's okay. At certain distances, they can really do some harm. And if tear gas is involved, if you don't have a gas mask available, you have to find something that would be a remedy against tear gas. I found that vinegar, especially white vinegar from sugarcane, works fine. It can be an irritant, but it's much less irritant than tear gas. It can really neutralize tear gas. So you can have a cotton cloth, you know, an old T-shirt, soak it in a little bit of vinegar or a mixture of vinegar and some water, and just put it against your face, and that will neutralize the tear gas. A lot of people don't recommend this. If you Google this, you're gonna find that it's not recommended. But when you don't have a gas mask, this is really the closest that you can get to avoid getting irritated by tear gas. As I understand, it's being used more and more in these street demonstrations. So you can just always carry like a small bottle and a cotton piece of cloth, and just soak it up and press it against your face. Never run into a canister of tear gas, of course, but just try to turn away and try to soak your face in it. The next, please. And so carry a backpack. This is important because, you know, you can just put your, you know, whatever in it. You can put your helmet in it. You carry water, carry some snacks. Sometimes when you're doing coverage, you don't really know when's the next time you're going to get something to eat. So carry, like an energy bar or something like that. A piece of cloth also, something that can be used to soak a wound or maybe apply a tourniquet in case you need it. Sleep well the day before. Eat a good breakfast. Again, you don't know the next time you're going to eat again, and stay hydrated. I learned this lesson fairly on in my career when I was a rookie reporter and sent to cover what my editor thought was like a regular meeting of a teachers union. It turned a little bit violent. Two factions were disputing control. One faction locked the other faction inside the hall along with the reporters, and we stayed there for like 36 hours, eating only like whatever junk food some people were bringing in. So you really have to make sure that you carry some supplies in your backpack. Have emergency contacts in a laminated card, in your wallet or in your pocket. The emergency contacts with the information for medical information. If you have insurance, or your doctor, a blood type, allergies, medications that you're taking, things like that. Legal assistance, emergency contacts. Is there a lawyer that you can contact in case you get arrested, for example? Emergency contacts, other reporters, your editor, who needs to be contacted in case something happens to you, in case you end up in the hospital or in jail. If you notice that you're being followed, especially when you're stepping away from a protest and you notice that people are following you, look for a safe place, especially a crowded place, a restaurant or something, a coffee shop, and call a contact, which can be another reporter, which can be your editor, and see what you can do, or how they can get you out of there. Next, please. First aid skills are always a plus. If you don't have first aid skills, you can always take a course. But here in Mexico, the Red Cross offer them for free. I don't know in the U.S., but I guess in fire departments or things like that, they can give you some orientation to where you can take a good first aid course. But they're always a plus. Sometimes you get you can get frozen when something happens and when you really need to apply those skills. Sometimes you just like black out and don't remember anything. But sometimes they can come in handy. How to treat a wound, how to apply a tourniquet, how to do CPR, things like that. They can come in handy in an emergency situation. Okay, this is very important because this is not about what you carry or what you do, but this is more about how you're moving around a protest or a political rally. Avoid getting in discussions with protesters, activists, campaign workers, candidate supporters. Sometimes they trick you into engaging with them in a debate. They complain about the coverage, or they say that the media is the fake news or whatever. Don't engage with them. Try not to, because first they outnumber you. So that's really not going to end well. If you get tricked into engaging with them in a heated environment, don't do it alone. Make sure that you're accompanied and that there is a way to diffuse the situation. People don't always keep their heads cool in an environment like this. As a reporter, we always have to keep our heads cool. Sometimes we forget about that. But we always have to be reminded that we really need to keep a level head and a cool head and not engage with people in discussions. Also, avoid situations where you can be accused of campaigning for someone, proselytizing for someone, or in the case if you're covering election day, interfering with voting. There is always very strict rules, for example, how to conduct yourself in a polling place. If you're in them, you can be accused of being, by people who don't like you, of campaigning for a candidate or something like that. Always avoid those those situations. If you're in a protest, always avoid a situation in which you can get tagged as being for one side or against another side, even if it's just the appearance. And this is my third point, which it can be sometimes controversial, maybe not politically correct, but this is really important. Be careful how you dress so you don't resemble a protester or a counter-protester, right? You have to examine how they dress and try to keep, dress normal, dress casually, but don't dress with a t-shirt that reads Black Lives Matter, for example, right? Because you don't want to be caught in a situation where one side can accuse you of, or can mistake you for being a protester or a counter-protester. I know this has some tones of racial profiling and it can be controversial, but for your own safety, you really have to be very careful how you dress and try to avoid certain appearances. Okay, before we go on digital security, now I'd like to ask you for, what kind of situations you've been able to document, or what are the examples that you've been compiling? If we can start with things that have been going on in Colombia or things that you have witnessed directly. I don't know if anybody wants to start. You can just raise your hand. Or turn on your mic and start speaking.
Yeah, you can just unmute yourself and speak up. And I know I'll start calling names because I know some of you have actually covered protests and I can see you and you can see me. So go right ahead.
In Colombia, there was a tear gassing incident over the summer at one of the protests. And I know there's been situations where there's just people bring AK-47s or semi-automatic weapons to protest, saying that they're going to defend protesters, things like that.
Well, going into a situation where people are carrying firearms is, I think it's really one of the more delicate situations. I hadn't really thought about, I've been aware of some cases, I saw the picture of the couple that went outside and this guy was pointing an AR-15 at the protesters. If you spot people who are carrying firearms, just run as far away from them as you can. Just stay as far away from them as you can. If a gunfire breaks out, again, identify your place to shelter, especially those that are made out of cement, brick, cement. Avoid wood or plastic or even metal. Sometimes metal can be easily penetrated. Always, or certainly glass, always hide behind something that is rock hard, cement, concrete, brick, rock. But always try to be aware of where the gunfire is located, where is it coming from, so that you don't go put yourself in a situation where you go get yourself in front of the bullets. I don't know how many cases there have been when there has been actual gunfire, rather than just people showing off their weapons. But of course, any place where people are carrying out, especially openly carrying firearms, is a situation that can deteriorate very, very rapidly. So, if you identify that, just try to stay as far away from that as possible. Because, it's hard to say if they're loaded or unloaded. So, in the absence of that information, you just assume that they're loaded and that they're going to start using them at any moment.
I also have one question.
Yeah.
Because you were just talking about how to dress when you cover protests and things. Something I've seen some local journalists in our area do is wear bright orange vests. I don't know is that something you would recommend for a journalist to wear?
Yeah, that can help. That can help along with an ID, so that you're more readily identifiable. The problem with wearing bright vests is that you might be mistaken for a security officer or a paramedic, fireman, but something associated with the police. And I don't think that it also in this climate is something that you would also want. You know, it's really a situation of whether you feel safe in it. But the problem is, if you dress like a protester, you're going to be mistaken by the police is going to mistake you for one. But if you dress in an orange vest that is similar to what, you know, authorities in the area are wearing, then you might be mistaken by protesters, and you can also get in some kind of trouble. My recommendation in that case would be that you can carry one, but if you see police officers, if you see other people that are wearing that kind of vest, then don't, you know, because they might be mistaking you for a group of people to which you don't belong. You know, you're press. You can dress in one of those reporters' vests that are very associated with journalists, you know, that the ones that have a lot of pockets. And so you can pass off as a journalist if you dress like that. If you slap a sticker that says press, you know, much better.
Thank you.
What else? What else have you guys seen out covering some of these events in Colombia?
Even at
Yeah.
kind of Black Lives Matter protests that have occurred like several months after kind of the initial events of the murder of George Floyd, there's still kind of a lingering threat of these armed militia groups that say they're going to show up, and then it's always kind of up in the air whether or not they actually do. I imagine that the best thing to do in that kind of situation is just be prepared for the worst.
Yes. I mean, when you're planning your coverage, so you have to first, well, what's the coverage about, right? What's the protest about, for example? Is it a Black Lives Matter protest? Yes. Okay. So what have been the incidents that have been occurring in this kind of protest? And from there, you develop the safety measures that you're going to take. If as part of that planning, say the day before, you get wind or you get the announcement that these militias, alt-right or whatever you call them, are going to show up. But they usually advertise them, even if it's sorry, that was my kid. Anyway, if you get at least a wind that they're going to show up, you prepare for that. Like, you know, you prepare for, like I was saying with the firearms earlier, even if they're not used, even if they're not activated, you have to assume that at any moment they will be, right? So if you're doing a protest where you got wind that there is going to be a counter protest, so you have to prepare for both cases. If during the protest you see that the counter protesters are not showing up, never take for granted that they are not going to show up. You know, you have to better to say, you know, they might get here any minute, so you have to be ready for that. You have to be ready for all eventualities. I think, you know, I would go back to one of the first cases, which is the one in Charlottesville, where there was this protest, and then the counter protesters sort of came out of nowhere. And so nobody was really prepared to what to do in a confrontation like that. I think now you have to assume that both sides are going to show up.
This summer, before the militia decided to start showing up at these events, there were some marches that sort of started off peacefully, but then as night fell, so the damage was done. Does someone want to contribute some thoughts about those and what kinds of things transpired here in Colombia over the summer?
Hey. Okay, so yeah, basically like in the Vista, everyone probably saw like a lot of the, I guess, shop fronts were damaged, including Panera, which is one of my favorites, so that was unfortunate. But yeah, so That was kind of, I mean, mainly just like breaking windows and stuff, but that also wasn't really when there was an active protest. That was more like looting at night. So that wasn't really something where I feel like journalists were in danger because most of them had gone. But one of the things that did stick out to me around that time was they had set some cars on fire. And the issue with that was it caught like a tree or a power line on fire. And that's something that I hadn't thought of, like staying away from those things that could possibly like fall on you if it were to spread. So that was, I think, the most worrying thing for me was like spreading a fire. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it adds another level of danger, you know, when it's not just a protest, or even when the looting is done in the context of the protest. When, in my experience covering protests in Mexico, when the looting is done in the context of the protest, as the protest is taking place, it is less intense than what happens afterwards, because there is at least part of the group of protesters that try to restrain some of the lootings. I mean, they're more aware of the optics, they're more aware of how it's going to look and the damage that it's going to do to the movement, right? So it can be more contained. After the protest ended and everybody went home, and then some of the most radical elements come back and start the looting, that's when things usually tend to get out of control. Sometimes, you know, when covering a protest, where you have to sometimes get in the middle of the action, because you have to talk to the people there, you have to see what's going on. Sometimes when looting is going on, it's better not to get too close, especially because, like you were saying, there is a lot of collateral stuff that can happen at any moment. You know, they throw a firebomb into a restaurant, and then the fire catches something that's very combustible nearby, like a tree, or it can be a billboard or something like that, and then all hell can break loose. If there is a canister of some sort of fuel there, like a gas tank or a gasoline barrel or something, you know, that's going to get and you don't know what's around. So you have to be in a safe place, fairly distant from the action, but not too distant as you don't get to see what's going on. And also try to, again, in your situational awareness, try to make sure that you're not, you know, things are not falling off on you. There is a great quote attributed to Robert Capa, the great photographer in the Spanish Civil War and World War II, because he died when he stepped on a landmine in Vietnam. And he said something like, if it's too far, you don't have the picture, and if it's too close, you don't live to take it. So you have to find that middle ground. It's really hard to find it sometimes, but you have to at least be aware of your surroundings and try to make sure to find the best place possible.
I wanted to add on to that actually a little bit, because I actually covered those protests over the summer. I was there with some of the other people in here who are from GMG, like Daily Gamecock, and some other people at SGTV who unfortunately aren't here. But I did want to say that I had a couple different questions about that. Because while we were there covering the first protest, so like the first, just to give you some context, the first day of protest here after the murder of George Floyd was the day that at night it kind of like it escalated, got more violent. The first day that we were covering it, it was kind of like, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and people at the protest, it was very peaceful, started getting word that there was a counter protest coming, like maybe some members of like the Klan or something were coming, and that was like getting around. People were talking about it, and a lot of people were questioning, like, is it safe to still be here? Like, what's going on? But then you also have to kind of weigh that with, like, if something happens, it's, you know, is it our job as journalists to be there to cover it if something does happen? So like I said, that was just one example of things like that happened. We actually got out of there before anything really escalated that day. And so I was curious as to what you thought about that, because another thing that I see is, like you say, like, especially with like looting and violence, like get as far away from it as possible. But I mean, like, you look at like some of these big journalists on like NBC News and CNN and stuff, and they're like, I saw this one journalist who on like a live broadcast. I don't know if you guys remember those scenes of the Target getting looted, but like this one journalist who literally was standing by the door, like in the doorway of Target as these people were running out with like stuff from the Target and stuff. And I'm like, he's fine. I saw another journalist who was walking through the streets as tear gas canisters were falling beside his feet. And I was just like, that is crazy. Like how, like, you know what I'm saying? So I'm kind of curious to see, like, you say there's this balance, but it seems to me like almost as like the higher up you go in like journalistic organizations, like these journalists are like right there, you know? So I'm curious to see what you have to say about that.
Well, I mean, there are a lot of there is degrees of craziness that journalists have, especially when getting into dangerous situations. In my experience, when you get into increasingly dangerous situations, is that you have more training. You've been in those kinds of situations many times, so you have more idea of what to expect. You know, this, you know, I made all of this that I mentioned, you know, for people that, you know, and I'm guessing you guys are really just starting to cover things like this. I also know that a lot of reporters in the U.S. are starting to cover things like this for the first time, because this is something that didn't usually happen, right? So the reporter that you saw, probably the one that you mentioned, that's like running into the tear gas, maybe he didn't really have any experience covering like this. It's not that he had been like, you know, he had come back from covering the Arab Spring, or that he'd been in Afghanistan or something like that. It's maybe just a regular local reporter. Sometimes you get too excited about this, and sometimes you get lucky, and you come away unscathed and with some, you know, great pictures and some great footage of what's going on. I don't really advocate getting too close to a risky situation, because there are just a lot of variables that can happen, unless that you feel reasonably safe. You have to constantly keep assessing whether it is reasonably safe to just like move a little bit closer and a little bit closer. What happens if you run into a, I don't know, a cloud of tear gas, right? And you don't have your mask on, right? So you get blinded. If you get blinded and you keep running, you completely lose all sense of orientation, right? If you're blinded and you're still walking, you will eventually trip into something or crash into something, and then something is going to happen. Harm can result from that. So you have to be fairly sure that, you know, you are that it's safe. You can go fly. You know, you can walk into a cloud of tear gas if you have a mask on. That's no problem. You have to have the mask, right? If you don't, then that's just really stupid, because you're going to be blinded, and you're going to, you know, lose an idea of where you are, and you know, you can eventually result in other type of physical harm. So what I say when I say balance is, you know, if you have to stay up late to see what happens, because there is at least a possibility that something might happen, because there are some crazy people out there, then you have to stay all night, right? Because your reward in that case will be that if, you know, something blows up, you're going to be the one who got the story. But, you know, don't stay too close, right? That's really my advice. If you're going to get close, you have to measure the risk in every step of the way.
I want to just emphasize something Javier just said. You see professionals out there doing things, and you might be covering the same events they're covering. Don't assume that person has more experience than you and knows what they're doing, and don't assume you should follow their lead. One is because they could have different training than you, and so they're better prepared to be in that situation than you are, or even worse, they could have no training, and their stupid behavior could be leading you into more danger. So you have to assess your own abilities. Is sort of what Javier was saying at the very beginning. It's assess your own abilities and your own skills in that given situation, and not necessarily take cues from people who you don't even know. Don't assume they know more than you, or that they have better skills than you.
once I was covering a protest in the state of Oaxaca in southern Mexico, and it was I think the first or the second day that I had arrived, and we were covering a riot, and it involved police forces that had these small tanks that they shot out water. In this particular instances, they mixed water with chili powder, and it was worse than tear gas. But some of the reports that were covering it, we took place behind the vehicles, so that we could be reasonably protected from all the projectiles that was flying around. And the protesters were using makeshift projectiles, and they were like tubes filled with shards of glass and nails, and they were just shooting them in the air. And I was walking with a colleague, another reporter, and this guy had been in Oaxaca for like 3 months covering the protest. He knew the lay of the land very, very well. But he got a little bit careless, and he got a little bit curious, and he stepped outside the sort of like the cone of protection that the tank was giving us, and he got hit with some nails, with a projectile that was loaded with nails in the chest, and he had to be taken to surgery. And I mean, really bad experience, because it nearly killed him. But he trusted that he would be fine, because he said, he probably said, I've done this a lot of times over the past few weeks. So he stepped out a little bit, just a little bit, and just like half of his body, and then the projectile struck him. So you never know. You have to always try to be as safe as you can, and be very aware of the danger. And like Michelle says, no matter how seasoned another journalist is, sometimes they're going to take reckless decisions, or they're going to move in a reckless fashion, because sometimes they tend to trust in their training a little bit more, and that is really a mistake. Sometimes you get a great story. I don't deny that. The reporters that go out and push ahead, sometimes they get the greatest stories, but the downside is potentially worse than that. Now, does anybody know, or can anybody mention, before we move on, can anybody mention specific cases of journalists being attacked by either protesters, counter-protesters, or police?
Yeah, here in Colombia, one of the WIS reporters, I think her name was Miranda Parnell. I may be pronouncing that wrong, but she got hit in the head by a rock. I think it's the same day that Ward was talking about, and someone else, when they mentioned that the police cars caught on fire. I think it was that same afternoon she got hit in the head by a rock.
Was she wearing a helmet?
No, I don't think so.
And do we know who threw the rock?
I can't recall, but she said that the protesters were just marching down the street, and then someone showed up in like a MAGA hat, and that's what like caused things to get really violent. And I don't know if she like actually got in between the two groups, or if one of the groups just threw something at her for no reason. But yeah, I just remember like being on Twitter that afternoon and just seeing the coverage, and then next thing I know, like she posted a picture of her head bleeding. Yeah. Yeah,
in the heat of the moment, it's hard to tell if you were targeted or if it's just, something that flew and you got hit by it. If you like, if you get your head, if you don't have your head covered, but you start seeing things flying around, take out like I said, your bike helmet or something, and just put something on, or try to get away from the trajectory of the projectiles. I mean, I don't know. In this particular case, it could have been a case of just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it's the rocks that the groups were throwing at each other. But still, if you get too close, that's one of the consequences. Does anybody have like an example of a journalist that has been deliberately targeted? No, you can't think of any?
I don't have one from Colombia, but I did see a video of like a police officer or security guard yanking a camera out of someone's hands.
Mm.
I can't remember what protest or where it was. I just remember seeing a video on that.
Okay, well, that would be the case, and that's of course completely inappropriate. There is really no recipe for dealing with that kind of thing, because if you start arguing with a police officer that wants to take your camera away, you might end up in jail. One of the reasons why I mentioned that one always has to be accompanied, at least in pairs, is that somebody else can document an instance like that. For the life of me, I can't still figure out why police officers keep doing what they're doing when they know that they're getting caught on tape. I just can't figure it out. I can't really explain why they keep doing if they know that they're being filmed. Why a police officer would take away a reporter's camera, or why a police officer would attack a journalist, especially if he's being taped, filmed, is beyond, I really can't explain. But it's a good element for embarrassment, right? I mean, it's a way to denounce that instance of police abuse. And if you pile enough of those, then you might shame those people into taking it easy the next time they encounter a reporter. That's one of the reasons that one should always be accompanied, is that you can have somebody there to document what's going on. Because again, things can get heated, and police officers can get frustrated, and they can just start targeting people at random, including and especially journalists. But never try to get in an argument with a police officer. You're just going to get yourself arrested. Or if you want to get yourself arrested, get in an argument with a police officer and become a First Amendment martyr or something. But that's more dangerous as well, because there are additional risks to that. Okay.
Javier, I had a question.
Okay, sorry, Carolyn.
That's all right. Has there been, in your experience, a moment when you did get caught up in the story too much and you sort of lost track of your surroundings, or an editor wanted to pull you back and you wanted to stay in the thick of things?
Yeah, I think it was in the beginnings, or when I was just beginning to be a reporter. I wanted to get every detail of people that were being wounded in protests. And I got myself get hit a few times, by people who were clubbing a protester. But that's just because I just wanted to get close. That example that I pulled from experience, the one about not getting too wrapped up, and it's different when you're not well, in the old days, when television reporters actually had to carry a big camera. It was harder for them to get into really, really close. They got close enough, right? But when you're not carrying anything, you are more free to move around. And so you are more prone to get yourself in trouble. So yeah, I've in my experience, I've gotten too close in the case of police officers beating up a protester that I got I got hit with a club also a few times. In another case was the instance of a shooting that I couldn't figure out where the bullets were coming from, and it was a friend and I that we were covering this in our hometown, and we came we came pretty close to sort of being in the crossfire of a shootout between Army and a drug cartel here where I live. But that was just because it was dark and we didn't know where they were driving without headlights, and we didn't know where which way they were pointing. And we were inside our cars, so we were parked, but at some point we realized that we were pretty close to the place where they were shooting. But because we had nobody had actually caught shooting as it was beginning. We really got caught in the excitement of actually seeing it happen, because it was also the first time, or one of the earliest times, that it happened in my city before it really got caught up in the drug war. That we were kind of excited that this was going on. We eventually came to regret that excitement much later, but at the time, we sort of got too wrapped up in that story. So I think those are some of the lessons that I always give about, always try to keep your perspective, and always keep an eye out for what's going on in your surroundings.